At 4:50 in the morning, on February 21st, 1943, Brigadier General Paul Robinett stood in a shallow wadi 20 miles east of Tebessa, Tunisia, watching German panzers mass for an attack he knew would come within hours. The panzers belonged to General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The man who had driven British armies across North Africa for 2 years. Rommel had just spent 3 days smashing American forces through Kasserine Pass. Now he was coming for Tebessa, the main Allied supply base. If he took it, he would cut off thousands of American troops and capture enough fuel and ammunition to sustain his Afrika Korps for months. Robinett commanded Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division. He had 48 Sherman tanks, 31 tank destroyers, 3 infantry battalions, and 11 artillery batteries. Against him, Rommel was bringing the 10th Panzer Division, elements of the 21st Panzer and the Italian Centauro Armored Division. Maybe 120 tanks total, plus mechanized infantry and artillery. The numbers were close. The experience was not. Rommel had been fighting in North Africa since February 1941. His troops had won battles at Gazala, Tobak, and dozens of smaller engagements. They knew the desert. They knew mobile warfare. They knew how to coordinate tanks, infantry, and artillery into combined arms attacks that had broken British formations repeatedly. Designed to fight other tanks in theory, not under the conditions they faced at Sidi did in practice. The doctrine failed them. American tank crews were taught to maneuver aggressively in the open, to seek out enemy armor and destroy it with mobility and volume of fire. What they were not trained to do was fight in broken terrain, under coordinated artillery, against an enemy that had spent 3 years perfecting combined arms warfare. Their doctrine assumed parity. The Germans brought mastery. At Sbeitla, the ground was flat, exposed, and offered almost no natural cover. The American tank companies moved into the valley exactly as they had been taught, forming line abreast, advancing to engage. It was the worst possible choice. German gunners on the ridgelines had perfect fields of fire. Their artillery was already plotted. Their Panthers and Mark IVs waited hull down, showing only turrets. The Americans showed everything. Within minutes, the opening shells tore into the U.S. formation. Tanks screwed up one after another. Crews bailed out into a hail of machine gun fire. Radios overloaded with reports of hits, fires, dead commanders. The coordination they had practiced at Fort Knox evaporated the moment the first artillery salvo landed among them. By mid-morning, Combat Command A was gone, burning, shattered, fleeing. Rommel wrote later that the Americans had fought bravely, even desperately. But bravery cannot compensate for inexperience. Yet the Germans made a mistake of their own. They believed this easy victory was the rule. Not the exception. It was not. Because as Rommel's panzers pressed westward, they encountered something they had not expected: American units that refused to break. Not because they were veterans, not because they were tactically skilled, but because after seeing what had happened to the 1st Armored, they were angry. They were scared, and they were done running. The learning curve of the U.S. Army in Tunisia was steep, brutal, and paid for in blood. But it was getting steeper for the Germans, too. Soon, the same commanders Rommel dismissed as amateurs would begin adapting, improvising, and punching back. He saw exactly what he had predicted 3 days earlier in his journal: an army fighting by separate branches, not by combined arms. To Rommel, the scene unfolding below was not chaos, it was confirmation. The Americans were fighting a 1939 battle against an enemy perfected by 1943 realities. Everything the U.S. Army had structured its doctrine around assumed clean separations of responsibility. Tanks fight tanks. Infantry fights infantry. Artillery supports from the rear. Tank destroyers. Wait for breakthroughs. Each branch had its own mission, its own role, its own neat little box. Nothing overlapped. Nothing was redundant. Nothing was flexible. The Germans, watching through binoculars from ridgelines and command posts, saw something different. Opportunities. German doctrine was a web. German armor never advanced alone. Their infantry rode on tanks or marched close behind. Their artillery displaced forward in bounds, ready to open fire within minutes of new targets being identified. Air support was called in as part of a plan. Not an emergency, every part of the German attack connected. To every other part, tanks pushed the Americans into infantry kill zones. Infantry flushed the Americans into artillery kill zones. Artillery forced the Americans into tank kill zones. Anti-tank guns closed every avenue of escape. The Americans were not caught by surprise. They were caught by a system. At Sidi, that system worked perfectly. From Rommel's command post, the battlefield unfolded like a training film. American Shermans rolled forward, spaced too widely to mass fire, too closely to avoid enfilade fire. No infantry screened the wadis. No scouts probed ahead. No artillery shifted forward to suppress German guns as the tanks advanced. Rommel watched the Shermans fire on suspected tank positions, shooting high, shooting short, firing blind, while German 75mm and 88mm guns dug in and invisible, cracked open the American columns. He watched the gun flashes. He watched the impacts. He watched the black smoke rise. By late morning, he wrote in his notes, "Their courage is admirable. Their doctrine is fatal." By the night of February 16th, the results were American losses were crippling. Nearly 100 tanks destroyed or abandoned, hundreds of casualties, infantry battalions shattered, artillery captured or overrun to combat commands effectively. Annihilated for the first time since landing in North Africa, the U.S. Army had faced a major German armored attack and lost almost everything. And yet, something else happened that Rommel did not fully appreciate at the time. As the sun set over the wrecked Shermans at Sidi, a shift was beginning quietly, invisibly. But irrevocably, American officers walked the battlefield that night. They studied what had happened. They talked to survivors. They listened. They learned for the U.S. Army, Tunisia was not the end. It was the beginning. Rommel had just given the Americans the most brutal lesson of the war, and they were going to spend the next 18 months repaying it with interest. RML's plan at Kasserine was, in concept, the same plan he had executed at Sidi Bouzid and Sbeitla, but on a larger scale, with higher stakes, and with a speed that the Americans were still psychologically unprepared to confront. And from his perspective, everything he had seen in the preceding 5 days reinforced his confidence. The Americans fought bravely, but reacted slowly. They defended tenaciously, but moved reluctantly. Their commanders meant well, but thought procedurally, as if war were a checklist instead of a fluid contest. Ward's collapse at Sbeitla only confirmed what RML had written earlier. The Americans needed months, not days. To become a threat, he arrived at Kasserine believing one more blow would finish them. The road to Kasserine passed by the night of February 17th. The 1st Armored Division was a wreck. Half its tanks written off in 4 days of artillery pieces, lost half tracks, and trucks abandoned. On roads and in wadis, battalions reduced to ad hoc companies' communications, systems shredded, commanders displaced, missing, or overwhelmed units that had arrived in Tunisia as clean. Well-equipped formations were now exhausted, shaken, scattered. Many survivors marched west through dust and rain, passing burned-out columns of their own vehicles still smoldering by the roadside. Yet the terrain ahead, though. Twin passes of Kasserine South and Sbeitla North formed the first position where the Americans could anchor themselves on high ground. It was not a prepared line, but it was at least a defensible one. RML intended to break it the same way he had broken everything else. Speed, coordination, envelopment. The attacks begin 0450 hours. February 19th, assault starts before dawn. The Afrika Korps assault group struck Kasserine Pass from the south. Their goal was simple: break the line push into the valley beyond Turn. North toward Tebessa on the American supply base at the same time. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division moved toward Sbeitla in the north, hoping to punch through, swing west, and joined the Southern force in a pincer around the 2nd Corps HQ. On RML's map board, the arrows were elegant, symmetrical, inevitable, and he believed it could work. But this time the Americans were no longer scattered companies on hilltops or tanks blundering into wadis. They were retreating into a choke point narrow, steep, anchored on ridgelands and, for the first time since the campaign began, their resistance would begin to stiffen. What Rommel saw from his forward observation post, he watched the opening of the battle much as he had watched Sidi, American infantry in fixed positions. Artillery behind them, still mostly static tanks, held in reserve with no coordination, defenders reacting instead of anticipating. He dictated another report to his staff. His tone was confident, perhaps too confident. He believed the pattern of the past days would repeat itself. In his mind, the Americans had not yet shown an ability to adapt under fire. He did not see what was coming. The turning point was not on a map. The Germans were still tactically superior. They still had the initiative. Their attacks were still coordinated better than the American defense. But something had changed that wasn't visible through binoculars. The Americans had been hurt, but they were no longer shocked. They had learned, brutally and rapidly, what Rommel thought would take 6 months. They had watched units destroyed, friends killed, positions overrun, and now their backs were against the last mountain pass before their supply base. They were angry. They were desperate. They were no longer willing to run. For the first time in the North African campaign, the German advance was about to encounter something it had not yet faced: American resilience. The passes would not be held cleanly. They would not be held gracefully. But they would be held long enough for reinforcements, long enough for coordination, long enough for the tide of battle to begin to shift. Rommel was attacking the same disorganized army he had beaten at Sidi, but he was not attacking the same soldiers. Rommel stood on the heights above Kasserine Pass on the evening of the 20th of February, watching the smoke drifting westward, watching American units withdrawing in ragged lines toward Sbeitla. He had achieved what he set out to do. The pass was taken. Stark's line was broken. The road to Tebessa lay open. For the first time in the campaign, the German flag stood on the western slope of the Grand Dorsal. His officers, his staff, even his drivers expected the next order to be obvious: push to Tebessa. Finish the 2nd Corps. End the campaign. It seemed so simple, yet Rommel hesitated, and that hesitation, just 6 or 7 hours of uncertainty, became one of the most consequential moments of the entire Tunisian campaign. The decision point, from his vantage point, Rommel could see the immediate tactical picture, which looked overwhelmingly favorable. The Americans had retreated in disorder. Their lines were unprepared and improvised. Their artillery was relocating under pressure. Their armor was scattered, damaged, or refueling. Their infantry was exhausted after a day and a half of constant attack. But the operational picture was far more complicated. His problem was not the Americans, it was logistics. One. Fuel: the Afrika Korps was running low on gasoline. Every mile west consumed fuel they did not have. Every destroyed American truck, every burning half-track on the road behind them was a reminder of what they themselves could lose if their own tanks ran dry. 2. Ammunition: German artillery batteries had fired thousands of rounds in 4 days. Resupply was slow to slowed, dependent on vulnerable routes through the mountains and over cratered roads. 3. Coordination. With Rommel's other forces, Rommel had 3 thrusts: north toward Sbeitla, west through Kasserine, southwest toward Gafsa, for the plan to work. All 3 had to break through and converge simultaneously. But in the north, at Sbeitla, British and U.S. units were holding. Rommel could not turn north to encircle 2 corps if his northern prong was still blocked. 4. The British intelligence. Reports warned that British 6th Armored Division and elements of the 1st Army were moving rapidly toward Sbeitla and Tebessa. The moment the Germans emerged from the mountains into open ground, they would be exposed to a fresh armored counterattack. 5. The clock every hour brought the Allies closer to reorganizing. Every delay made the German window smaller. Rommel knew this. His instinct was to strike immediately before American leadership stabilized, before British reserves appeared, before fuel shortages froze his panzer groups. But another instinct pulled at him, caution born not from fear, but from experience. The same caution that had saved his forces in the desert time after time. The debate at the command post that night. RML's command tent was filled with tension. Reports came in. The 21st Panzer Division was stalled north of Sbeitla. American artillery at Tebessa had re-established firing positions. British reinforcements were only hours away. The Italian Centauro Division was behind schedule fuel. Trucks had not reached the front. Ammunition convoys were delayed as staff officers recommended a pause. His divisional commanders warned about outpacing supply lines. His logisticians insisted the panzers could advance, but could not fight a second major battle without resupply. RML paced. He knew the truth. If he gambled and lost, he would lose everything. If he paused and waited, he might lose the opportunity forever. In the end, he compromised a fatal decision. He chose to push, but not immediately. Not with everything he had. He allowed his units to rest. He waited for the stragglers. He waited for the fuel columns. He waited for the 21st Panzer Division to catch up. And while he waited, the Allies did something he did not expect. They built a real defensive line. What happens next? By dawn on the 21st of February, the Allied line around Tebessa and Jebel el Hamra would be reinforced, reorganized, and integrated by British 26th Armored Brigade. British artillery with fire discipline the Americans had never seen. Elements of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, fresh American artillery battalions, the remnants of Stark's regiment, now dug in with discipline and fury. And, for the first time in Tunisia, the German advance would meet not chaos, but coordinated, concentrated fire. RML did not know it yet, but his moment had passed. The road to Tebessa was open. The opportunity was real. The window was closing. And when his panzers rolled forward again on the morning of the 21st, they were about to run headlong into the first truly unified Allied defense of the entire campaign. Robinett moved like a man who hated surprises. He drove every mile he could on the 19th and 20th, stopping to walk ridge lines, speaking to patrols, measuring slopes with his eye. Where others saw only scrub and rock, he saw fields of fire, avenues of approach, places to hide tanks and bait the enemy. He rejected the obvious choke where the main road squeezed through a wadi, too exposed, too easily bracketed by artillery. Instead, he looked for terrain that would force the attacker to come. To him, on narrow fronts and under observed fire, what he chose was a small, jagged spur of the Grand Dorsal that dropped into the valley east of Tebessa. From its crest you could see the western approaches, the twist of the road, and the wadis that funneled armor into predictable lanes. There were terraces and low stone walls that could be turned into firing positions, a few gullies where anti-tank guns could be hidden at long range, and just enough cover to mask tank emplacements until the last moment. Once the position was selected, Robinett did the work he knew best. He made it survivable. He placed tank destroyers where they could interdict the main approaches at slanting angles, dug in infantry on the knolls to deny enemy infiltration, and sighted artillery where observers could see both the valley and the road. He insisted on mutually supporting arcs. No Sherman would advance without infantry screens. No infantry would hold without a direct fire plan from the 75s and the tank destroyers. No battery would fire blind. Forward observers were posted in forward foxholes and on donkey tracks well forward of the ridge. Robinett paid particular attention to concealment and deception. Tanks were dispersed into shallow hollows, their tracks masked with brush. Dummy holes and smoke pots were laid out to invite fire. Ammunition dumps were staggered and camouflaged. Route discipline was drilled. Columns would not move on main roads during daylight. He tightened radio nets, assigned liaison officers to the French battery and the scattered cavalry elements, and rehearsed withdrawal corridors so retreats, if required, would be controlled and not a rout. He also kept a reserve. Robinett understood that a good defensive scheme was nothing without a hand to plug the inevitable hole. A reinforced company of tanks and a motorized infantry platoon were kept 2 to 3 miles behind the spur, ready to counterattack or shore up a sector under particularly heavy pressure. Orders were simple and specific. By time, channeled the Germans into the kill zones. Hold until British armor and the heavier U.S. guns could arrive. By nightfall on the 20th, Robinett's map was a web of interlocking fires, fields of observation and contingency routes. His men were tired and under strength, but they understood the mission. What he could not change was the yawning gap between his thin line and the nearest. Substantial Allied reserve, but he could make anyone trying to rush that gap pay heavily in men and metal. When dawn broke on the 21st, the spur east of Tebessa would be thinly held, imperfectly supplied and brutally tested. But it was not chosen by chance. It was chosen by a man who read terrain like a book and who believed that careful preparation could beat superior shock on the battlefield. What Rommel and his panzers would meet there would not be the disordered columns of a retreating army. It would be a prepared trap. Robinett's defensive scheme in the Bahat, Fusana Valley was not complicated. It was correct. It was the first American position in the entire Tunisian campaign that fully exploited terrain, understood German tendencies, and imposed a battle on German terms that the Germans did not want to fight. The position that could bleed a Panzer Division, everything in that valley worked in the defender's favor. A flat, open valley floor that turned German armor into perfect silhouettes, wadis offering natural hull-down pockets for American tanks and tank destroyers, ridge lines for observation, infantry coverage, and artillery spotting. Narrow defiles that forced the attackers into predictable, bracketable lanes. Clear fields of fire that made German maneuver visible and punishable. Robinett recognized all of this immediately. He understood that German doctrine relied on combined arms fluidity. The valley stripped that away. It forced German armor to lead, forced German infantry to follow exposed, and prevented artillery from being brought forward quickly or cohesively. In effect, he was designing the opposite of Sidi Bouzid. A battlefield where the Americans set the terms, Robinett's deployment won, tanks and hold-down. Positions Shermans and tank destroyers were placed in wadis. Turrets only Visibleglasis plates hitting. Pre-ranged unlikely approach points fallback wadis mapped in case the first positions were compromised for the first time. American armored units would not be advancing blindly into 88s. The Germans would have to advance. Into them, too. Infantry on the ridgeline. Robinet spread his riflemen along the ridges, not in thick clusters, but in thin, overlapping bands, machine gun teams on reverse slopes, slopes, dug into terraces. Warder squads dug into terraces there. Job wasn't to defeat the tanks, it was to kill the German infantry trying to get close to the American armor. The Germans had relied heavily on infantry infiltration throughout the desert campaigns. Robinett shut that door. Forward observers in high ground pockets. Observation was everything. Robinett placed foe teams in shallow scrapes just below Crescent Knuckles, where two valleys converged in concealed alcoves cut into the ridge face. From these vantage points they had miles of visibility. German assembly areas, preparatory columns, refueling trucks, even artillery batteries behind the pass. All of it was observable. For the first time, American artillery would fire first accurately and continuously for pre-plotted kill zones, every likely German entry route, every defile, every bend in the valley. Every flat where tanks might try to mass was pre-registered :105s on the valley floor 155s. On assembly point tank destroyers on the right. Flank Shermans bracketing the left defile. Robinett forced the Germans to choose between advancing into killing lanes, or detouring into terrain where they could not maneuver, or waiting for alternative routes, which costs time. The one thing Rommel no longer had: the first solid American defense by the night of February 20th. Combat Command B was arrayed across Bahat Fusana Valley like a sprung trap. It was thin, much thinner than Robinett wanted, but it was coherent, interlocked, and invisible from German observation. More importantly, It was the first position where tanks, infantry, and artillery were mutually supporting terrain was used deliberately. Not incidental fire was planned rather than reactive German maneuver was constrained American. Strengths were finally exploited. American weaknesses were minimized. Robinett didn't have the flash or bravado of other commanders. He never pretended to be a Patton or a Rommel. But he did something neither of them had done in Tunisia up to this point. He built a defense. The Germans could not simply roll over Robinett's valley was not where the entire tide of the campaign turned, but it was the first place in North Africa where the Americans fought the Germans on equal terms. It was the first place the Germans would fail to break through. They were experienced soldiers, hard used after months of fighting in North Africa, but confident, aggressive, and well-led. Allen's men knew how to dig in, how to use the terrain, how to coordinate with armor, and how to hold a line under pressure. Robinett integrated them into the defensive matrix with precision. He placed rifle platoons along the ridge lines overlooking the wadis, giving them dominant observation and interlocking fields of fire. Light machine gun teams and barmen covered the open ground between the tank positions. Mortar squads had pre-adjusted targets just below the crest lines so that if German infantry made it across the valley floor, they would enter a lethal band of indirect fire. The infantry, protected by the terrain and supported by artillery, would serve as both shield and sensor spotting enemy movements, suppressing German infantry and keeping Panzer Grenadiers from closing with the Shermans. Robinett also understood the importance of mobility. Behind the primary positions, he established a series of fallback lines, secondary wadis, reverse slope positions, and pre-surveyed hold-down locations. If a position was compromised, or if German pressure increased, American tanks and infantry could displace a few hundred yards and resume the fight with minimal loss of cohesion. This layered defense would force the Germans to fight through multiple prepared lines under constant artillery fire. Communications were the backbone. Robinett ensured every tank destroyer section, infantry company, and artillery battery had clear radio procedures. Forward observers could shift fire from one concentration to another in seconds. If German armor massed on a flank, the Shermans could maneuver. The artillery could saturate the axis of advance, and the infantry could tighten their perimeter all before the panzers reached effective firing range. Robinett's defensive scheme combined all arms armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air liaison to a single integrated system. It was not simply a static line. It was a trap. The valley floor was the killing zone. The wadis were the teeth. The ridgelines were the eyes. And the artillery was the hammer waiting to fall. The Germans expected another disorganized American defense, like those they had smashed weeks earlier. What they would find instead was something entirely different. A deliberate, layered, mutually supporting position built by a commander who understood how to turn terrain into a weapon and how to make every element of his force work in concert. When the panzers finally appeared at the mouth of the valley, they would be entering a battlefield Robinett had already solved. They came forward cautiously, motorcycles first, then armored cars moving in the dim pre-dawn light, engines muffled, silhouettes faint against the gray horizon. The valley was quiet except for the distant clatter of tracks and the occasional thump of a German 75mm gun firing probes into suspected American positions. But the shells landed harmlessly. Robinett's men held their fire. They stayed low in their foxholes, tanks silent in the wadis, observers glassing the flats from the ridgelines. The Germans saw nothing. This was deliberate. Robinett had given explicit orders. Do not reveal your positions until the main force commits. Let the Germans believe for just a few more minutes that they had caught another shattered American rearguard. Let them believe the valley was open, unprepared, undefended. At 0515, the reconnaissance vehicles withdrew to the west. Their reports carried back to armored commanders waiting near the exits of Kasserine Pass were exactly what Robinett had hoped for. No organized resistance visible. No obvious fortifications, No sign of tanks and strength. The valley looked like empty ground at 0630. As the first light of dawn crept over the ridgelines, the panzers came. 2 companies of German tanks emerged from the pass, moving in disciplined formations, Panzer IVs forward. With their long-barreled 75mm guns scanning left and right, lighter vehicles and half-tracks behind, dust plumes rose behind them as they accelerated across the valley floor. Panzer grenadiers clung to the backs of the tanks, rifles ready. From the ridges, American forward observers watched calmly. They tracked the German movement along the pre-registered lanes, confirmed the predicted approach axis, and waited for the order to fire. Along the wadis, Sherman sat motionless, crews tense but steady. Guns laid on aiming stakes hammered into the earth the night before. Tank destroyer crews crouched in their forward positions, peering through sight apertures, waiting for the final yards to close. Infantrymen on the ridgetops gripped rifles and machine guns, watching the advancing armor as if staring down an oncoming storm. Then, as the German tanks reached the first fire line, Robinett gave the order at 0648. The valley erupted. Artillery fire crashed down in pre-registered concentrations, ripping through the German vanguard. The forward tank destroyers fired their opening shots, knocking out the lead vehicles and forcing the panzer column to bunch. The Shermans in the wadis opened up next dozens of 75mm guns firing in. Perfect coordination from hull-down. Positions the Germans had never seen. German formations. Staggered. American infantry on the ridges poured fire into exposed panzer grenadiers. Mortar bracketed the flanks. Communications nets buzzed, calm and efficient, exactly as Robinett had drilled them the night before, for the first time in 6 days. The Americans were not the ones caught by surprise. They were not the ones unprepared or outmaneuvered. They were fighting on ground of their own choosing, from positions they had crafted, following a plan they understood. And as the sun rose over Bahat Fusana Valley, it was clear the German attack had walked straight into a killing field. Robinett had built stone by stone, gun by gun, soldier by soldier, through exhaustion, doubt, and retreat. Now the battle truly began. He had a choice: pull back and preserve his strength, or push on and gamble everything on breaking the American line before his fuel ran out. Asterisk. Rommel chose to push. He ordered his reserve tanks forward, signaled the Barcellari to dismount and advance on foot, and told his artillery to fire smoke to screen the panzer's movement. For a moment, the battlefield disappeared under a white-gray haze. German tanks lurched ahead blindly, trying to close the distance before the Americans could retarget. But Robinett had prepared for this too. American forward observers on the ridge. Lines had plotted every likely point where German forces would try to reform or regroup. The moment the smoke went up, they shifted fire to the next set of concentration numbers, valley choke points, dry creek crossings, and the shallow depressions where German tanks were likely to halt. The shells arrived before the Germans even cleared the smoke. High explosive rounds detonated in rapid succession. Panzer crews, confused and half-blind, veered off the valley floor and into the open, where Shermans waiting in the wadis could pick them off. Machine guns from the ridges tore into Barcellari infantry as they tried to advance. Mortar bracketed the flanks. Every time the Germans shifted, American fire adjusted within minutes. At 1500 hours, the panzers made one last effort. A group of 8 Panzer IVs surged ahead, trying to punch through the center before the Americans could react. They accelerated across the flats, engines roaring, guns firing. For a few seconds, it looked like they might break through the forward infantry screen. Then Robinett committed his last reservist mobile tank platoons, hidden behind the central ridge. Sherman surged out of concealment, firing on the move. Combined with the tanks in the wadis, they formed a deadly crossfire. One panzer erupted in flames. Another lost a track. A third turned to withdraw and exposed its side, another kill. Within minutes, the counterattack collapsed. The survivors pulled back in disorder, leaving burning vehicles scattered across the valley. Rommel watched grimly through binoculars. He could see the truth now. This was no shattered American rearguard. This was an organized, coordinated, deeply prepared defense, exactly what the Americans had lacked everywhere else in the Kasserine battles. Robinett had built a trap, and Rommel had driven straight into it. His fuel situation was beyond precarious. Several tanks were nearly dry. Ammunition was dangerously low, and every hour he remained under the American guns was another hour of pointless casualties. At 16:30, Rommel made the decision. He ordered a withdrawal. It was controlled at first, but as American artillery resumed harassing fire and Sherman crews picked off stragglers, the retreat became increasingly chaotic. Trucks burned in the valley floor. Wounded soldiers limped back toward the pass. Tank crews abandoned vehicles that had run out of gas. For the first time since crossing Fade Pass, the Germans had been stopped cold, and Paul Robinett, methodical, unflashy, problem-solving Paul Robinett, had delivered the first undeniable American defensive victory of the North African campaign. The valley he had chosen, the positions he had built, the team he had forged under pressure had turned the tide. Here is a polished continuation that preserves your tone, pacing and narrative style while sharpening clarity and dramatic cohesion. I keep all factual elements intact while tightening transitions and giving Rommel's final assessment its full weight. He wrote that the Americans had fought with skill, discipline, and remarkable coordination. Their artillery had been swift and precise. Their infantry had held their positions stubbornly. Their armored counterattacks had been timed with intelligence and purpose. He had faced an enemy very different from the one that had broken at Fade. At Sbeitla, at Kasserine itself, he had expected to drive through them. Instead, he had been stopped cold. For the Americans, the disaster at Kasserine Pass remained undeniable. 6,600 casualties. A battered 1st Armored Division. Hundreds of vehicles and guns lost. Units shattered. Commanders relieved. Confidence shaken. But the Germans did not win what they had come for. They failed to take Sbeitla. They failed to seize Tebessa. They failed to destroy the 2nd Corps and on the valley floor at Jebel el Hamrath. Thanks to Paul Robinett's careful preparation, integrated defense, and unyielding execution, the Americans had shown they could stand and fight. It marked a turning point. The Germans had reached the limit of their strength. Their fuel was nearly gone. Their ammunition was low. Their veteran units were bloodied. Montgomery threatened from the south. Allied reinforcements poured in from the west. Strategic initiative was slipping away. When the Germans withdrew through the pass, the Allies followed cautiously. Reoccupying Kasserine on February 25th, the battlefield lay silent, burned-out tanks, wrecked trucks, shell-cratered ridges, the last smoke drifting across the valley where Robinett's guns had shattered the 2nd day's attack. In the aftermath, American commanders studied the battle with ruthless honesty. They relieved officers who had failed. They reorganized units. They rewrote procedures for combined arms operations. Most importantly, they learned it was the most painful kind of education. But Kasserine was not simply an American defeat. It was the last German victory in North Africa, and a hollow one. Rommel's offensive had stalled. His corps had been forced to retreat. The Wehrmacht would never again conduct a major offensive in the African theater and in a battered valley east of Tebessa. The Americans had proved something crucial to the Germans and to themselves. Given the right leadership, the right position, and the right coordination, they could fight the best the Axis had to offer and hold. That lesson would shape the rest of the war. He saw how Americans integrated their tanks, tank destroyers, infantry, and artillery once they had a defensible position, and commanders who understood how to use it. He saw how they reacted to failure, not by collapsing, but by reorganizing, repositioning, and fighting again. And he understood something his peers did not. The Americans were inexperienced, not incapable. Most German commanders misread the battle entirely. They saw only the early routes at Fade, at Sbeitla, at Kasserine. They fixated on the columns of abandoned vehicles, the captured guns, the shattered armor battalions. They dismissed the later American stand as an anomaly accident of terrain or luck or British interference. They looked at the casualty tables and declared the matter settled. RML knew better. He had watched U.S. forces rally. He had watched them coordinate massed artillery with speed and precision rivaling German fire direction. He had watched American tank crews use defilade, hull-down positions, and disciplined fire control tactics they had not employed a week earlier. He had watched infantry hold ground under pressure that would have broken them. Days before, he saw a trajectory. His peers saw only a snapshot. That difference mattered. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring saw Kasserine as proof of American inferiority. To him, the offensive had demonstrated precisely what he had believed before the campaign began. Americans were brave, but poorly trained. Lavishly equipped, but tactically naive. Aggressive, but brittle. He pushed for renewed offensive action, insisting the Germans could drive the Second Corps back again, perhaps even push them out of central Tunisia altogether. Most of the German high command agreed. They interpreted the casualty totals as confirmation of their assumptions. They believed they had shattered the backbone of U.S. forces. They believed the Americans would need months to recover. RML stood nearly alone in his assessment. He wrote that the Americans had recovered with surprising speed, noted that their artillery had been particularly effective, warned that their defensive coordination showed rapid improvement, and he concluded that once properly led, Americans would be a formidable opponent. It was a judgment grounded in observation, not ideology. The Germans had seen American weakness. RML had seen American potential. The German high command chose the wrong interpretation. They would pay for it first in Tunisia, then in Sicily, then in Italy, and finally on the beaches of Normandy and in the fields of France when the same American army they dismissed as incompetent became one of the most powerful, mobile, and lethal fighting forces in the world. Kasserine was a German victory. But RML understood it was also a warning. RML's second assessment was clear, methodical, and uncompromising. He laid out the evidence. The chaos at Sidi on February 14th. The near collapse at Sbeitla on February 17th. The controlled, coordinated defense east of Tebessa on February 21st and 22nd. He noted the speed with which American forces had stabilized, reorganized, and integrated combined arms. He highlighted the effectiveness of artillery fire, the disciplined use of terrain, and the careful coordination between tanks, tank destroyers, and infantry. Most striking to him was the pace of learning. 7 days of combat had transformed inexperienced, scattered units into a cohesive fighting force. RML emphasized that this adaptability was unprecedented in his experience. British forces had required months to recover from early defeats in North Africa. French forces had largely failed to recover after 1940. Italian units had struggled throughout the war. In contrast, the Americans had turned lessons into immediate tactical improvements within a week. He warned that this rapid learning curve, combined with superior equipment, logistics, and manpower, meant that American forces would soon be formidable opponents. He urged the German high command to adjust their assumptions, to recognize that early victories and captured equipment did not indicate permanent weakness. The Americans were inexperienced, yes, but each engagement made them more effective. He predicted that within months, under proper leadership, they would be capable of matching German forces in skill and coordination. The warning was ignored. Hitler Kesselring, most of the German staff clung to the early reports from Kasserine. Americans were weak, poorly led, and would collapse under pressure. This misreading hardened German strategy for the remainder of the North African campaign. It shaped expectations in Sicily and Italy, leaving German commanders ill-prepared for the Americans' rapid evolution into a disciplined, adaptable, and ultimately decisive force. In hindsight, RML's assessment was prophetic. Kasserine Pass was not merely a tactical engagement. It was the moment when the Germans first saw the potential of American forces and failed to act on them. RML saw clearly that the Americans had learned the essential lessons of modern, Warfare in a matter of days, lessons that many European armies had taken months or years to grasp. First, combined arms coordination. Tanks, infantry, and artillery could no longer operate as independent forces. Tanks without infantry were exposed to enemy close assaults. Infantry without mobile firepower could be overrun. Artillery without observation could not respond to shifting threats. At Tebessa, every element operated together, each supporting the other, forming an interlocking system that maximized strengths and minimized vulnerabilities. Second, proper positioning. Units needed to be mutually supporting with overlapping fields of fire and clear lines of withdrawal. Isolated positions invited disaster, as had been demonstrated at Sidi, where infantry battalions perched on hills were bypassed, cut off, and rendered irrelevant to the fight. At Tebessa, Robinett's forces were positioned to cover one another, to channel the German advance into predictable zones, and to provide rapid reinforcement wherever pressure developed. Third, artillery effectiveness. Properly coordinated artillery, guided by forward observers and pre-registered on likely enemy avenues, could stop even veteran armored formations in their tracks. Over 9,000 rounds fell on February 21st and 22nd, systematically destroying German tanks, cutting down infantry, and disrupting the momentum of the attack. American artillery was the decisive weapon on the battlefield, but only because it was integrated, observed, and carefully positioned. RML understood that these were not isolated successes. They were proof that the Americans were learning, adapting, and internalizing the principles of modern combined arms warfare. What had been chaos in the first days became discipline and lethal coordination by the 7th. This rapid assimilation of lessons made the Americans far more dangerous than the Germans had anticipated, and RML knew that ignoring this evolution, as most of his peers would be a fatal mistake in the campaigns yet to come. RML saw that the Americans were learning faster than anyone expected, and the lessons they internalized were profound. Fourth lesson: leadership matters. Early failures at Sidi and Sbeitla were rooted in fractured command structures. Division commanders had split forces into multiple combat commands with separate missions, failing to coordinate timing or support. The result was confusion and collapse under pressure. At Tebessa, Robinett exercised unified command. He knew every unit, every position, every mission. Officers understood their sectors and how to coordinate with neighboring units. That clarity translated directly into effective action under fire. Fifth lesson: preparation beats improvisation. The initial American responses were reactive. Units rushed forward piecemeal. Reconnaissance was minimal, and support relationships were undefined. In contrast, Robinett spent 2 days positioning his forces at Tebessa, studying terrain, identifying kill zones, pre-registering artillery fire, and rehearsing contingencies. Every unit had a defined role, a clear sector, and contingency routes. This deliberate preparation created cohesion and resilience that had been absent in the first days of combat. Asterisk. American commanders absorbed these lessons quickly. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the 2nd Corps during Kasserine, was relieved on March 6th. George Patton assumed command immediately, bringing discipline, energy, and clarity of purpose. He insisted that every officer know their units, their sectors, and how to coordinate with support elements. He instituted aggressive daily training in combined arms operations. Accountability was his first order of business. Units would know exactly what they were supposed to do, and failures would not be ignored. Through these reforms, the Americans transformed from untested, fragmented forces into an organized, professional army capable of taking the lessons of Kasserine and applying them across the Tunisian theater and beyond. Patton's fifth action, built on all the lessons of Kasserine: preparation for offense. He recognized that defense alone could slow an enemy, but decisive victory required initiative. He insisted that 2nd Corps train for coordinated attacks, integrating infantry, tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery into synchronized maneuver. Every attack would be planned, every supporting fire pre-registered, and every unit rehearsed in realistic scenarios. Reconnaissance would identify avenues of approach, obstacles, and likely enemy positions. Commanders would know exactly how their units fit into the larger plan, and units would practice flexibility to adapt to unexpected developments. Patton's training emphasized speed, aggressiveness, and cohesion. Units practiced rapid movement under fire, coordinated assaults across multiple axes, and immediate exploitation of success. Tank crews learned to advance with infantry protection, while artillery and forward observers practiced calling fire on moving targets. Soldiers drilled in communications, mutual support, and battlefield discipline until these procedures became instinct. By the time Second Corps moved back into the field, it was no longer a force recovering from shock and confusion. It was a cohesive, disciplined, and confident army, capable of both holding ground and seizing the initiative. The bitter lessons of Kasserine had been absorbed, transformed into doctrine and practice. For Patton, preparation, discipline, and integrated training were not abstract concepts. They were the foundations upon which the Americans would rebuild and ultimately dominate in North Africa. The German advance quickly unraveled. American infantry on the surrounding hills swept fields of fire across the valleys and gullies, picking off exposed mechanized infantry and suppressing any attempt to reorganize. Tank destroyers hidden in hold-down positions fired on advancing panzers, striking from angles the Germans had not anticipated. Engineers had prepared obstacles and likely avenues of approach, slowing the attack and channeling the German forces into kill zones. By mid-morning, the attack had collapsed entirely. German tanks were burning, infantry scattered, and mechanized vehicles immobilized. The coordinated, combined arms tactics that had saved the Americans at Tebessa were now being applied in a methodical offensive. Patton's insistence on rehearsed maneuvers, integrated artillery, and disciplined command allowed Second Corps to absorb the attack without breaking. American counterattacks followed immediately. Tanks advanced under infantry cover, supported by rolling artillery fire. While engineers cleared routes for resupply and reinforcement, German forces were forced to withdraw eastward under constant pressure. For the first time, units that had been shattered at Kasserine were now executing offensives with precision and confidence. By March 23rd, failure of the 10th Panzer Division demonstrated a stark reversal. The same unit that had routed Americans 5 weeks earlier had been decisively repelled. Patton's emphasis on preparation, coordination, and leadership had transformed Second Corps into a professional fighting force capable of not only holding ground, but dictating the terms of engagement. The lessons of Kasserine were no longer theoretical, they had been internalized and applied on the battlefield, changing the course of the Tunisian campaign. By March 23rd, the lessons of Kasserine were no longer theoretical, they were being applied with deadly effect. The 10th Panzer Division, the same unit that had shattered American forces at Sidi, advanced across open ground expecting an easy victory. Instead, they met a force transformed M3 half-track tank destroyers. Once ineffective at Sidi, now fired from hull-down positions on reverse slopes, with infantry covering their flanks. Each German tank that exposed itself was systematically destroyed. Within 4 hours, 28 panzers lay in flames or abandoned on the field. When German units tried to flank, American artillery adjusted instantly, interdicting movement and cutting down more vehicles. By evening, the 10th Panzer Division withdrew, shattered and demoralized. For the first time, American forces had decisively repelled a German armored counterattack. The contrast with earlier defeats was stark. Same German division, same American equipment, but now leadership, training, and preparation made all the difference. Patton had spent 4 weeks rebuilding Second Corps, enforcing discipline, integrating combined arms tactics, and rehearsing both defensive and offensive operations. The results were now visible in every engagement. Subsequent German attacks on Guettar over the following week failed repeatedly. American defensive positions were too strong, artillery too effective, and infantry and armor coordination too precise. By early April, German forces in southern Tunisia were in full retreat, falling back toward their final defensive lines. RML did not witness these battles. He had been evacuated to Germany on March 9th for medical treatment, leaving the Americans to consolidate and exploit the hard-won lessons of Kasserine. The transformation of Second Corps from disorganized, inexperienced units to a disciplined, coordinated fighting force was complete, and the battlefield outcomes proved it beyond doubt. RML had learned a critical truth. The quality of an army was not fixed by its early failures, nor by preconceived notions of national or racial superiority. He had seen American units collapse in February, then rebuild in a week and execute coordinated lethal defense at Tebessa. He had seen them take those lessons and, under capable leadership, transform into a professional, disciplined force capable of repelling attacks that would have broken most armies. By March 1943, the Americans under Patton were no longer the same troops that had fled Sidi or lost cohesion at Sbeitla. Artillery destroyed German armor. Defensive positions were properly coordinated. Infantry, tanks, and tank destroyers acted as an integrated system. RML recognized that leadership and preparation, not raw courage or innate talent, were decisive. Properly led, properly positioned American soldiers could fight as effectively as any German unit. This understanding shaped every subsequent assessment he made of Allied capabilities. When he returned to Europe to command Army Group B in late 1943, RML repeatedly warned Hitler that the Americans could not be underestimated. He argued that Germany's only chance in Normandy was to defeat the Allied landing before it could consolidate and exploit its advantages in equipment, its artillery, and logistics. Once established, he knew Allied forces with proper supply lines and superior materiel would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible. To dislodge RML's strategic judgment was grounded in observation, mathematics, in logistics, not ideology or the illusion of German invincibility. The lessons of Kasserine and the transformation of Second Corps were proof that adaptability, leadership, and preparation could overcome initial weakness and that ignoring these principles could prove fatal. RML's analysis went beyond the immediate battlefield. He recognized a fundamental strategic truth. German tactical skill could win engagements, but it could not overcome the vast industrial and logistical capacity of the Allies. He calculated that Allied production exceeded German output by factors of 5 to 10, depending on the system. American factories could churn out tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates Germany could never match. Allied logistics, despite the U-boat threat, delivered those weapons to the front lines. Training systems produced competent soldiers faster than German. Casualties could be replaced. The result was an inexorable trajectory. German victories could be temporary. They could inflict losses, disrupt supply, and delay advances. But they could not stop the overall momentum. If Allied forces were allowed to establish themselves in Europe with secure logistics and proper supply, they would grind Germany down through sheer weight of material. Kasserine Pass had been an early illustration of this process. In February, inexperienced American forces had suffered catastrophic losses. But even in defeat, they had the resources and leadership to learn and adapt. By March under Patton, they had transformed, applying lessons from Kasserine systematically. By May, they were consistently winning engagements. The trajectory was clear. American forces would continue to improve, and German forces would face an opponent growing stronger by the week. Hitler and much of the German high command ignored these lessons. They clung to the myth of German superiority, pointing to burning American tanks at Sidi, prisoners marching through Tunisian villages, and the chaos of early retreats. They remembered only the early losses and forgot the disciplined, coordinated defense on the last 2 days at Tebessa. RML saw the truth clearly. Kasserine was not evidence of American weakness. It was evidence of American adaptability, speed of learning, and the ability to turn defeat into operational competence within 72 hours. He understood that ignoring this lesson would be far more costly than any tactical setback could ever suggest. RML's realization was stark and immediate. On February 21st at 1400 hours, as the German attack stalled in the Bahat Fusana Valley, He expected to witness the same chaos, the same rout. That had characterized American forces in the first days of the campaign. Instead, he saw something entirely different: organized defensive fire, coordinated artillery, tanks fighting from hold-down positions, infantry covering flanks, and a fully integrated combined arms defense that rivaled anything the British had achieved in North Africa. In that moment, he understood the strategic implications. 9 days of defeat had not broken the Americans. They had retained cohesion, discipline, and the will to fight. They had observed, learned, adapted. That capacity for rapid adaptation, combined with their industrial output and logistical reach, was a force that German tactical skill alone could not overcome. The battle at Kasserine was a tactical victory for Germany, but a strategic warning. He conveyed this to his staff on February 23rd as the withdrawal began. The Americans had absorbed their losses, studied their failures, and would return stronger. Second Corps, though battered, would rebuild, retrain, and improve. Every misstep the Germans had allowed in those first 3 days' splintered attacks, piecemeal engagement, missed opportunities had given the Americans the chance to transform. His staff did not comprehend the danger. They focused on captured equipment, prisoners, and territory gained. They saw victory. Rommel saw the missed opportunity and the emerging threat. He knew that the next time German forces met the Americans in the field, they would face not disorganized troops, but a disciplined, adaptive, and increasingly formidable army. The tactical gains of February has already sown the seeds of strategic peril. The historical arc validated Rommel's insights from Kasserine. American forces absorbed early defeats, learned rapidly, and transformed into disciplined, effective combat units. By April 1943, they held their own against German counterattacks in Tunisia. By May, they were conducting offensive operations. And by May 13th, when Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, Second Corps had matured into a competent, battle-ready force. This pattern repeated in Sicily, July 1943, and Italy, September 1943. American units initially struggled, adapted quickly, and achieved steady advances. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, American forces were among the most capable in the European theater. Demonstrating the lessons learned from North Africa, Rommel never again faced American forces in combat. But the experience at Kasserine shaped his strategic outlook for the remainder of the war. He understood the lethal combination of Allied industrial capacity, logistics, and adaptive leadership. Germany's only chance was to prevent the Allies from establishing a foothold. Once established, they would become unstoppable. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed at Normandy. Rommel was absent from his headquarters, celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany. By June 7th, Allied forces had secured their beachhead. And by June 10th, over 300,000 troops had landed and were advancing inland. Rommel immediately recognized the reality. The Allies were established, supplied, and growing stronger. Germany could not stop them. The strategic calculus he had drawn from Kasserine about adaptability, its preparation, and the limits of tactical skill against material and logistical superiority had come to full fruition. On July 17th, Rommel was injured when Allied aircraft strafed his staff car, further removing him from active command. Yet the lessons of Kasserine had already been imprinted. A single battle, when studied carefully, had revealed the transformative potential of American forces and the strategic consequences Germany would face if it failed to understand them. Rommel's story ended tragically, but his judgment about American forces endured. After being implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler, he chose suicide on October 14, 1944, at the age of 52, rather than face trial. Yet his assessments of American capabilities, crafted after Kasserine and refined over the following year, remained in German military archives. Decades later, historians would recognize them as remarkably prescient. Among the most accurate early evaluations of American military potential in World War II, Paul Robinett, by contrast, survived the war. His defensive stand east of Tebessa on February 21, 1943, was officially credited with halting the German advance and saving Tebessa from capture. He was wounded on May 5, 1943, when German artillery struck his jeep, severely damaging his left leg, and was evacuated to the United States, retiring from combat operations. He later commanded the armored school at Fort Knox until the end of the war. Despite these accomplishments, Robinett never received widespread recognition. The narrative of Kasserine Pass was dominated by early American defeats at Sidi and Sbeitla, and the successful defense east of Tebessa was largely overshadowed. Yet Robinett understood the significance of what he had achieved. His meticulous preparation, careful positioning, and integration of combined arms had stopped one of Germany's most capable commanders at a moment when victory had seemed inevitable. In that moment, Robinett demonstrated a timeless principle: properly led, disciplined, and prepared American forces could not only withstand German attacks, they could fight on equal terms and emerge victorious. His work at Tebessa would quietly shape the effectiveness of American armored and infantry doctrine for the remainder of the war. George Patton understood the significance of what Robinett had accomplished. When he assumed command of 2nd Corps in March 1943, he personally met with Robinett and debriefed him on every detail of the defensive actions east of Tebessa. Patton absorbed the lessons of Kasserine and immediately applied them to rebuild 2nd Corps. The combined arms coordination, pre-registered artillery, defensive positioning, and unit integration that Robinett had implemented became the standard operating procedure across the corps. By May 1943, 2nd Corps had transformed. Units advanced methodically across Tunisia, breaking through German defensive lines, capturing thousands of prisoners, and maintaining cohesion under fire. On May 7th, American forces entered Bizerte, and by May 13th, all Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. A total of 275,000. German and Italian soldiers were captured, more than the Axis had lost at Stalingrad. The transformation took just 12 weeks. From the disaster at Kasserine in mid-February to total victory in mid-May. 12 weeks of learning, adapting, training, and fighting. It proved RML's assessment correct. American forces were not inherently inferior. They were inexperienced, and experience could be gained. Mistakes could be corrected, lessons internalized, and performance improved. The speed of learning determined outcomes. At Kasserine, Americans adapted in 72 hours. At Sidi and Sbeitla, they had fought poorly. East of Tebessa, they fought effectively. That rapid transition compressed into 3 days of combat revealed the true potential of American forces. When properly led, RML had seen it clearly. Most German commanders had not. That difference in perception shaped strategic decisions throughout the war. RML advocated for realistic assessments of Allied capabilities and defensive strategies that accounted for Germany's increasingly precarious position. Lessons that, had they been heeded, might have altered the course of subsequent campaigns. RML's experience at Kasserine Pass illustrates how the gap between perception and reality can shape the course of history. Other German commanders, seeing only early American failures, advocated continued offensive operations, confident in German superiority. Their approach failed repeatedly in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and France. German attacks against well-prepared Allied positions incurred heavy losses while achieving little. Defensive operations were more effective tactically, but they could not compensate for the strategic imbalance. Germany simply lacked the resources to defeat the combined Allied forces, no matter how skillfully it fought. By early 1944, RML had reached a grim conclusion: the war was unwinnable. His observations at Kasserine had taught him that once Allied forces were established and properly supplied, tactical superiority alone could not defeat them. Germany needed a political settlement, but no settlement would come. Therefore, defeat was inevitable. He was correct, but correctness did nothing to change the outcome. Germany continued to fight until May 1945, resulting in millions of deaths, widespread destruction, and the devastation of Europe. Kasserine Pass was one of those moments when reality became unmistakably clear. The early battles highlighted American weaknesses. The later battles revealed American strengths. RML saw both and understood the implications. He tried to warn his superiors. They did not listen. This is how military failure occurs, not through lack of courage or skill, but through flawed assessments and wishful thinking. German commanders wanted to believe Allied forces were weak, and there was evidence to support that belief: the disaster at Sidi, the chaos at Sbeitla, the early breakthroughs at Kasserine Pass. But equally, there was evidence that contradicted it: the rapid American adaptation, the disciplined defense east of Tebessa, and the speed with which Second Corps recovered from initial losses. RML recognized the full picture. His contemporaries chose to see only what confirmed their preconceptions. Exactly, Kasserine Pass embodies the paradox of war. On paper, it was an American defeat. Heavy casualties, lost tanks, captured equipment, and temporarily ceded ground. Yet the real significance lies in what the Americans learned in the process. They internalized the principles of combined arms coordination, defensive positioning, and artillery effectiveness under fire. They adapted rapidly, taking lessons from failure and immediately applying them to future operations. RML recognized that paradox instantly. For him, the tactical outcome, German victory, was overshadowed by the strategic lesson. Americans were fast learners. Their ability to adapt under pressure, combined with industrial and logistical strength, meant that initial defeats did not indicate ultimate inferiority. In fact, those early losses catalyzed growth, producing forces capable of overwhelming German armies later in the war. Kasserine illustrates two essential truths of military conflict. You can lose a battle and gain the knowledge to win the war, or you can win a battle and fail to see the strategic realities that ensure eventual defeat. It was simultaneously an American tactical failure and a German tactical success. Yet it foreshadowed the eventual Allied triumph. Today, the farmland where Paul Robinett orchestrated his defense on February 21st is unmarked and quiet. Yet the echoes of that small valley shaped the trajectory of the North African campaign, ultimately the war in Europe. The absence of monuments belies the enduring significance of the lessons learned there. The physical landscape of Kasserine Pass preserves the memory silently. The wadis where Robinett's Shermans hid. The ridgelines where forward observers directed artillery. The valley floor where German panzers were destroyed, they all remain, yet unmarked. Modern highways cut through the pass. Tourists pass by unaware of the fierce battles that unfolded there. The hills are quiet, but the lessons echo. Preparation matters. Combined arms, coordination matters, leadership matters, and realistic assessment matters. These lessons, learned at such high cost in February 1943, shaped how American forces fought for the remainder of the war. RML too learned them. He understood that American troops, initially dismissed as inexperienced and incompetent, were fast learners and adaptable opponents. He tried to communicate that insight, though history shows how much or how little was heeded. Stories like Kasserine remind us that the outcomes of war are shaped as much by adaptation, leadership, and learning as by raw numbers or firepower. The landscape may be quiet, the monuments absent, but the truths remain. Your engagement matters by discussing these stories, by remembering. We honor both the lessons and the people who fought them. Where are you watching from, and what other North African stories intrigue you? These moments of history are waiting to be rediscovered.